Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of GaudiMitSpez22.com Podbean podcast YouTube video. Joined again by my partner in crime, the one, the only, Kale Zelden, who is a teacher, head of the humanities, probably academic dean still at Portsmouth Abbey. Are you still academic
No,
dean?
no, no, no. I'm a lowly teacher in the trenches, and I'm loving every minute of it.
You know, I was academic dean at DeSales University for
Yeah,
one year, and
yeah. Well,
I just about slit my throat. And
yeah, yeah. I was the academic dean for 6 years, and then I was the dean of faculty for 6 years. And for my toils and labors, they graciously allowed me to become a teacher again.
yeah, I remember when I got tenure. It was the year I was academic dean was the same year I got tenure,
Oh, wow,
and
wow.
the head of the rank and tenure committee was the provost, who was my immediate boss as dean,
Yeah,
and she was
yeah.
hell on wheels. I mean, she was an
Sure.
absolutely horrible person.
Oh, I'm
That was the
sorry. Oh,
that
oh.
was the most stressful year of my life. So I'm just going
I'm
to leave it at
sure.
that.
Yeah.
Damn near land me in the hospital. Anyway, what Kale and I, and of course, Kale has associations with Rod Dreher. Kale's been involved in the film industry, Hollywood, native of New Orleans, foodie. I mean,
Yeah.
you name it, Kale's done it. So this is great. We're going to be talking today about the latest sort of splash book that's out there, Paul Kingsnorth's book Against the Machine on the Unmaking of Humanity. There's the book for those who are watching. A beautiful, nice little cover.
It is a
I
great cover.
realize, I ordered this book last week, and there's nothing you can back me up on this, Kale.
Yeah.
There's nothing more infuriating in life than ordering a book, and then when it comes in the mail and you open it and you realize, crap, I already have this book.
Oh no. That's
I
too funny.
realized when I saw the cover, I thought, oh man, I ordered this already. And
That's
sure
really
enough,
funny.
I have two copies.
Well,
Anyway,
it is the Christmas season coming up here. It's Advent first, of course. I'm an Advent supremacist, but you can give
yeah,
it as a gift, Larry. You can give it as a gift, and it is
I
it
will
is
give it.
gift worthy, right? Whatever we're going to say today, it's gift worthy. It's read worthy. Full stop.
Absolutely. And by the way, before we get into it, I don't know if you have seen, but I am hosting a Gaudium et Spes gathering at my new house in Scranton, March 12th to the 15th. I would love it if you could make your way
If
down.
you will have me, I have openings. I can actually come. Now, we have a March break, which falls right at the heart of that. Larry, I'm coming, brother. I'm coming.
All right. Oh, that's
Yes,
fantastic. This
I'm
is great.
coming.
I mean, Amy Wellborn is going to be here, a few
Oh,
other,
fantastic. Oh,
and hopefully Father Harrison, heir of clerically
oh, great.
speaking. Yeah,
Great,
so
great.
it's going to be a fun gathering. Anyway, Paul Kingsnorth Against the Machine. For those of you who aren't familiar with Paul, Paul is an Englishman currently living in exile in the west of Ireland. The best way to describe Paul Kingsnorth, he's a writer and so forth, but I think he's actually just a bit of a modern day prophet
Yeah.
that who sees in modernity great evil and great danger to human nature, and he's given the danger to that modern world presents to us the name simply of the machine. And
Yeah.
over the past 10 years or 15 or whatever, Paul Kingsnorth, I mean, he gave the Erasmus lecture for first
Yeah.
things. I mean,
Yeah.
he's a big deal, and it seems as if his message about the machine and technocracy has resonated even with neocon Catholic pro-capitalist types like the
Like
Acton
us.
Institute,
Yeah.
or like, oh, well, I'm not a neocon, but
No, me
nevertheless,
neither.
yeah. So anyway, in some ways, okay, I'm just going to say this. Paul Kingsnorth is, and I think he would agree with this, and the book is, we'll get into all the particulars. He's a neo-Luddite, as am I. Uh, let me just give one little personal story to get started here, and I'm going to dominate the conversation for like the first 5 minutes, and
Please. Yeah.
then I'm going to turn it over to Kale. Just fair warning. We just bought a new house, and one of the things I noticed on all the mortgage papers that one thing stood out to me more than anything. I mean, still, when you have closing costs, you have all these fees and taxes and blah blah blah, homeowners insurance, blah blah blah, a realtor, you pay money. There was one thing that stood out to me. It was called the transfer tax.
Oh,
Transfer tax,
yeah.
and that was several $1,000s. So I asked the realtor, I said, what the heck is a transfer tax? And he said to me jokingly, he goes, oh, that I call that the big just because we can
Yeah.
tax.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
You
gosh.
know, there's absolutely no reason why you should be taxed just because you have the privilege of transferring one property to another person. But the government has decided in its wisdom, here's a perfect opportunity for us to bleed more money out of the citizenry, all right,
Right, right, right.
by simply inventing a new tax called the transfer tax, which is just us saying, oh, you're selling something, let's impose even more taxes on it. So, you know, and to me, that's a sort of metaphor for the ever encroaching hegemony of the modern state upon us. So a
Well, as
subtext.
just as a
Go,
funny
go,
side
go ahead.
note, I'm from
Yeah.
Louisiana, and for years, Louisiana had what was called a brake tag law, which was essentially just a tax on cars, right? It was before they called that in. Now, of course, it's all, you have to get your car inspected and da 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 da, right?
Yeah.
But in Louisiana, it was just called a brake tag, right? It was coming. Do the brakes work? Great. Pay, $10
Well,
and
there you
you can
go.
drive your car. It's the same kind of just because we can tax.
Yeah, the just because we can tax. And so there's a subtext to this book as well by Paul Kingsnorth. He's not only a neo-Luddite and he's kind of anti-technological progress. He also is something, I guess, of what you would call an anarchist
Yeah.
who stands, as am I, as was Dorothy Day. But of course, anarchism comes in a variety of flavors. There's even socialist communal anarchism, which intrigues me because I would think socialism and anarchism are contradictory terms. If you mean by socialism
Yeah.
state
Yeah.
socialism.
Yeah, that's an interesting little. Yeah, it's an interesting little footnote. We should maybe circle back to that. Keep going. Sorry.
Yeah, okay. So
Mhm.
I just want to begin. I'm going to, and I said this to Kale off camera. I'm going to begin with what I'm calling mild criticisms of the book.
Mhm.
And they are mild because overall, buy this book, folks. Read
Mhm.
it. It's well worth it. It's so well written. It just a page turner. Mary
Yeah.
Harrington has a blurb on the back where she said, I couldn't stop reading it.
Yeah.
I was the same thing. Came in the mail the other day. I couldn't stop reading it.
Shh.
It's a fantastic book and well written. So just please take with a grain of salt what I'm about to say. Paul Kingsnorth has a lot of very nice things to say about indigenous cultures and the manner in which the modern world of the machine and technology and the Leviathan of the modern state has this nasty habit of destroying and displacing indigenous cultures. And of course, he's entirely right about that. But absent from this book is any major critique of the fact that indigenous cultures are not prelapsarian. They
Right.
too were, I mean, indigenous cultures were often quite bestial. And oftentimes quite bestial precisely because they were emulating nature. More of that in a second. I mean, they engaged in slavery, human and child sacrifice, infanticide, euthanasia of the very sick, terrible forms of misogyny, and so on. Indigenous cultures often preyed upon one another, enslaved one another. And life in those cultures was often not the pleasant, bucolic, let's frolic in the meadow next to the roaring brook sort of thing that we get. So, in other words, I think there's a bit of a romanticization in this book of indigenous cultures and of nature. I want to remind folks of something that the historian Arnold Toynbee once said in his History of Religions. He talks about how early, I mean, nature is both mother and monster.
Right.
And,
Right.
and we can't idealize and romanticize a sort of back to the land naturalism without realizing, without remembering that animistic paganism engaged in the apotheosis of the various forces of the natural world. And that natural world was both evil and good towards human nature. And animistic religion simply projected onto the natural world anything that sort of had movement, the rather morally ambivalent characteristics of human beings writ large as part of and so what Toynbee points out is that a lot of the rituals that surrounded animistic religions in indigenous cultures, a lot of the rituals were actually an ancient form of technology.
Mhm.
They were
Yes.
the
Yes.
culture was controlled by the priestly classes, by the shamanistic classes, in often extremely brutal and horrible ways. One could even refer to the pagan animistic regime of the shamans and so forth as a machine
Right.
that was an
Right.
enclosure that
Amen.
kept people in place, and so on. There is no discussion of that in this book, nor is there a discussion of the fact that this is precisely one of the things that the Christian Revolution destroyed, that
Correct.
Christ destroyed.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
that I mean, you get this in the sort of Merlin mythologies as well. You know, that
Let's go
Christianity.
back to that because I want to talk specifically about Merlin later on. So please.
Okay, very good. And there's no mention here, therefore, of the pagan techne, the pagan machine that Christ obliterates. Where there's no mention here of the sort of Tom Holland thesis that, Christianity has revolutionized even our vision of nature and of the world in a way that we can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Paganism is forever in itself altered and changed, and post-Christian paganism is just going to be a shadow of its former self. I'd also like to note, too, on a different note, and then I'll turn it over to you, as what was part of the mild criticisms. There's a sort of hint here of what I call the myth of agrarian
Yeah.
self-sufficiency.
Yeah.
It's almost as if he critiques modern individualism and the atomized self and the need for a communal self, and he emphasizes that in local cultures that people have to cooperate with one another and so on. So I don't want to make this criticism more than it is, but there is more than a hint here in the book of a kind of that part of the problem with modern technological urban society is how dependent we are on all of these structures. And should those structures go away, we would die. And thus the government has a control over us. And that's all well and true. But I just moved from a farm. And let me tell you, this is
Yeah.
an absolute this is an absolute myth.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Unless I wanted to
Yeah.
live without electricity, without running water, without
Right.
toilets, I was utterly dependent on the grid. Well, get solar panels. Well, then you're dependent on that technology. Well, then just burn wood. Yeah, well, that's what we did a lot of. But then I don't have enough wood on my land, so I have to buy wood from
Right.
somebody else. You get the picture. There is no such thing as agrarian self-sufficiency. Agrarian people are almost as dependent upon outside forces for their survival as are uh, I'm from Nebraska.
Well,
That's Go
well,
ahead.
look,
I'm done. I'm done.
no,
I'm
no, no,
done,
no,
Jim.
no, no. This is good. I mean, this gets at the heart for me of this romanticism that you talk about, right? That um, and then really kind of asking the question, like, what is civilization for? Like, what is the nature of
Yeah.
civilization, right? And
Yeah.
an old friend of mine once quipped. He's a hardy New Englander and a kind of anti. Kind of had an anti-romantic strain in him, and he said, "Man, I read these British romantics, and only a Brit can be romantic about nature." He said, "Spend one winter in Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
New England. You can't be romantic about such things because, as you know, Larry, nature
Yeah.
wants to kill you, right?
Yes.
And look, I am an Anglophile like to my core. If you've ever been to England, yeah, people can complain about it's it can be foggy and dreary and what do they call it, old blighty and all that kind of stuff. But nature in England is really so tame. It is so calm. It's lovely, right? And only a Brit can be a romantic about nature in quite this way. And you can even kind of draw a distinction between British romanticism and German romanticism, which is, I think, a much darker thing. But, go no further than something like Hawthorne. Hawthorne, you get the image. I really do think you get that image of nature as being, much more inimical if left to its own devices than perhaps someone like Kingsnorth would lay out. And again, and I think that's like a temperamental thing, but I think it's worth sort of pointing out. And and to your point about nature in its kind of raw state being, in need of being tamed. I'm reminded of is this one of those great, early 20th century, monumental books. It's by a guy named Cochrane. I don't know if you know the book. It's called Christianity and Classical Civilization, and he really points out what among other things, right? But one of the things that I got out of that book when I read it when I was 20, back in the day, is that what Christianity does is it tames. It's a sort of a taming you might say machine, but and we can get into sort of
Yeah.
that, the idea of a machine versus the machine, because I do think that there's a
Yeah.
difference there. But
Good.
Christianity went to great lengths to tame nature, so that even if you look at the kind of the sacramental order, like to tame the waters, and when we see this in Genesis, of course, but to tame the waters, waters unto themselves are chthonic, inimical. It's a sort of a place of oblivion, and for Christianity to sort of take waters out of, to sort of take water as the initiation symbol into a different kind of oblivion. Again, I'm thinking sort of symbolically in this sort of symbolic sacramental order. It's no wonder that you would take water as this kind of chthonic force and use it, invert it, transform it into the sort of the ablution that cleanses us from fallen nature. I just think that's a kind of an important thing to insert into this larger conversation.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that seems to me to be rather strange about this book. I obviously love the book, drawn to it, and we're going to get into the positive elements of it in a second that you and I would both resoundingly
Mhm.
agree with. But it's a deeply, as I said to you yesterday in a text, I said it's a deeply Christian book, but strangely devoid of Christ.
Yeah, yeah,
You know,
yeah.
and
Do more with that. We lay it out because I
well,
agree with
well,
you.
in the sense that about the only place where towards the end of the book, when he's laying out practical methods of resistance, he
Mhm.
talks about, one of the things we need to recover is the ancient Christian practice of asceticism,
Right.
self-control,
Yeah.
that we need to rein in our appetites to realize that if we're
Mhm.
going to have liberation from this ongoing hegemony of the machine, we have to liberate ourselves from the various consumer products that the machine provides us with, and hence the need for ascesis. But then he immediately adds, oh, by the way, asceticism is also deeply embedded in just about every great religious tradition of the world. And he is
Right.
right about that. And
Right.
yet there are different motivations and different goals for the asceticism of Christianity, say from, I mean, the asceticism, for example, of Hinduism would be to liberate you from the illusion of
Right.
Maya, of the
Right.
of differentiation, of
And
individuation
and of self. Right.
and of
Exactly. Yeah.
self, and
Yeah.
so the destruction of the self, and that ascesis is required for moksha, or liberation from
Yeah.
samsara, the
Yep.
wheel, the endless wheel of karmic reincarnations. Well, Christianity has an entirely different motivation behind ascesis, and it's about the development of the theological virtues.
Well,
Okay.
yeah. It's funny that you bring that up. This idea of ascesis, or asceticism, right? As I was coming over here to the studio this morning, and it's really cold outside. Anyway, just so my mind going right as it does, and I want to look at Kingsnorth as a kind of digital stylite. If you
Yeah.
recall, if you recall, the stylites were these almost fantastic creatures in the early church where they would go and live on top of a pillar, as a kind of way of a radical disassociation from
Yeah.
the world, mammon, etc. And there's something kind of beautiful and awkward and odd about this. I mean, it's true. You can look it up. I mean, these are real things.
Oh,
And
Saint Simon the Stylite.
that's right, right, right. And so, but and I remember even as a kid being like, wow, that's really kind of cool. Like, wow, that's pretty radical. And I love that part of Christianity. There is a kind of a radicalness to it. And maybe that's one of the tensions that I think we're sensing here is that, there is both, Christianity as dominion and Christianity as radical critique, right? It always straddles this. You think of somebody
Yeah.
like St.
Yeah.
Francis as another example that, at certain times, there are these prophetic voices that are kind of needed in order to offer a kind of a purifying witness to the claws of mammon. But what I remember as a kid being struck by Simon the Stylite, Saint Simon the Stylite, that you know you literally can't live on top of a pillar without some kind of support mechanism, some
Yeah.
kind of support machine, right? And so, I'm perfectly fine with like two-speed Christianity, invoking here Charles Taylor's notion, which was a heavy critique of the Protestant Reformations, right? that we need to get rid of these sort of, the monks and priests and religious are the religious ones. We call them the religious. And then there are the rest of us schlubs who kind of go about our business. But I'm fine with that.
Me too.
That there are certain folks among us who are kind of called to this prophetic mode to kind of live on top of the style, to live on top
Well,
of the
yeah, I
column.
mean, Barron calls them spiritual athletes. It
Right,
doesn't mean
right,
I can't
right,
toss a football around in the
right,
backyard, but I'm not a
right.
football player.
Right. And so if we can kind of think of Kingsnorth in that vein, it certainly helps me make sense of the of his radical prophetic
Yeah, yeah.
voice.
I'm glad you brought this up because I was about to say, look, this is not a work of theology. And I'm a
Right. Good.
theologian,
Yeah.
perhaps seeking theological insights in the text
Mhm.
that just were never meant to be there. It
Mhm.
is instead a kind of amalgam of kind of social and political philosophy
Yeah. Yeah.
that he's trying to cast a wide net of allies, and we have
Mhm.
to keep that in mind. There's
Mhm.
a practical aim of this book. He wants the scales to fall at the eyes of people, to
Yeah.
wake them up to the nastiness of the machine, to have them get rid of their smartphones
Yeah.
and for themselves and their children. And so he's casting a wide net. So no, he's not going to engage in very particular theological constructions. It's more of a philosophical work. And yet
Mhm.
it's a philosophical work that has a spiritual. He talks all the time about the need for a spiritual revival, for the revival of the moral economies of traditional cultures and so on.
Right.
And yet I go back to then my critique. Well, the moral economy of traditional cultures, are you talking about the moral economy of traditional Christian cultures?
Yeah.
If so, you need to unpack that. I don't want to go back to the moral economy of the Ottoman Turks, and
Right.
I don't want to go back to the moral economy of ancient shamanistic uh,
Or
culture.
the Aztecs or, any of
Yeah,
these things,
exactly. So it lacks that specificity, but nevertheless, the book is simply a prophetic text of great, great power. So
Mhm.
let's move. I mean, if you don't mind, I mean,
Huh.
those are sort of our criticisms of the work,
Yeah.
but overall, our appraisal of it is glowingly positive. I loved the book,
Yeah.
but I'm going to turn it over to you. I know you've got some
Yeah.
notes. Uh,
Well, yeah, there are a couple of things. I love his discussion of modernity is, I think, really an important one. And for some people in the audience, this might be rather passe or okay, of course, that kind of thing. But I do think you know his work in reframing modernity, not so much as a time. But rather, he says modernity is not so much a time period, but it's a story we tell ourselves, right? And that story is the machine. And I think that's rich. I think that's important, right? Because, you know, modernity, the power of modernity suffers if we only see it as something that started in 1789, right? With the French Revolution and the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment.
right.
I think that is an over convenient um, move in which we can kind of distance ourselves from. We can kind of be returnists, with the V. That rather modernity is a kind of frame of mind, and not only is it a frame of mind, but it is a story that we tell ourselves about ourselves, right? And look, as a technology, modernity is in some sense a look, can we just agree to disagree and get along with one another? I mean, full flourishing modernity comes out of the religious wars that really decimated Europe. And so I'm caught in the aftermath of the Reformations, and I think as such that's an important understanding that it is an achievement of some sort. It is a a détente. So that we can kind of like go about the business of living. Now, the problem with modernity that way is that we pretend it's not a story. We pretend it's not some kind of cultural jig, right? That it is a subtraction myth, using Charles Taylor's terminology, that buries a lot of its embedded biases, right? And so he says, again, really spot on. He says that, every culture has a throne,
Yeah.
of the sacred order, right? And we are living through a time in which we pretend, and I think this is why he's such a potent prophetic voice, we pretend like we don't have a sacred order. But he's like, au contraire, we in fact do have a sacred order. We just pretend it's not.
Oh yeah, he mentions Eugene McCarraher's book, The
Right,
Enchantments of Mammon, and
right.
McCarraher makes that exact same point.
Yeah.
The secularization thesis, from Max Weber, maybe
Yeah.
on even through a little bit through Charles
Oh,
Taylor,
100%. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
is got its points to it, but nevertheless, the human being an incorrigibly religious animal is going to
Right,
seek some
right,
kind of an enchantment. We're going to seek
right.
enchantments.
Well,
All
we
right.
can't live without it, right?
Yeah.
And we pretend at our peril. And maybe one of the things that he's getting at is that modernity is the great pretend, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That we invented this thing. Well, I love this a lot. He says something like, we invented modernity and we called it like, the white man's burden, and we imported it on dreadnoughts. But now we call it development and import it through the World Bank, and just like boom, like wow, yes,
Yes.
100%. And and then the second point he makes, and again, I'm singing hallelujahs and hosannas as he says this. It's like we did it to ourselves first
Yes.
before
We
we
did.
exported it out to the to the furthest reaches of the British Empire. We did it to ourselves first here in the
Well,
Anglosphere.
he says that before Great Britain could uproot indigenous cultures, they had to first uproot the British
Yeah,
citizens themselves.
yeah,
And truer statement never. So, in other words, both his point and that of Eugene McCarraher is that we have enchantments; they're just piss poor ones.
right.
They're a bit ersatz and made up and
Yes,
counterfeit, and so
and
there
and,
is
and largely invisible to us, right?
yes,
That's
yes.
such a crucial point.
As always is the case when the enchantment is essentially one grounded in
Yeah,
the realm of cupidity, in the realm of
yeah. Oh,
concupiscence,
yeah,
in
yeah.
those elemental basic desires to live in material comfort and have sexual pleasure and eat good food and live in the full blush of health and what Berdyaev called the cult of bourgeois well-being.
So good. Yeah, so good.
Yeah,
So
those
good.
are enchantments. So, uh, you said earlier that you wanted, since we're
Yeah.
talking about enchantments, you wanted to talk about the Merlin mythology.
Yeah, well, and full disclosure, I'm ripping this straight from C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength, which is, about the machine, right? But
Yeah, oh, it is.
in the end of that novel, I believe it's Professor Dimble. I could be wrong on that, but I believe it's Professor Dimble. He's the Arthurian specialist in the St. Anne's group, and he talks about the haunting of logers, right? And he's using this specifically in terms of England, but he will say later on, it's like, look, this is not just an English thing. This is every culture has these sort of two kind of channels. He kind of talks about them, right? That there's this Britain, Great Britain, which is the sort of this long march of the machine, but going along with those things, kind of small and silent voices, is the voice of logers, right? This image of the enchanted golden age that is sort of a almost like a fellow traveler, like they're these sort of two frames, and that Logres is the sort of the spiritual heart of the land that is always kind of at war with the forces of Britain or the forces of the machine. And I may have jumbled that a little bit, but you get the basic
Yeah,
idea.
yeah, yeah,
That and so therefore, we must always carve out a space for the cultivation of logers. Logers is the name of King Arthur's realm, right? Camelot
Yeah.
his castle, but logers is the name of his realm, and so that there's this haunting, he calls it, this haunting of another way of seeing and being, that if we don't cultivate it, it gets squelched out by libido dominandi, etc.
Oh, absolutely. And yet I would say does not get squelched out completely.
No, 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 of course. I mean,
And
yeah,
then comes back. I'm struck by the fact you see Kingsnorth obviously is a fan of J.R.R. Tolkien and
hmm
Lord of the Rings
hmm
and that great sort of Christian mythology that
hmm
Tolkien constructed. He's obviously a fan of Lewis and his fantasy stories,
yeah,
fairies, Chesterton's fairy stories. I'm struck too by a recent book by Sebastian Morello, who I'm often in disagreement with on various things, where he talks about it's interesting. It's all the rage now in trad circles that for a long time were critical of von Balthasar for writing a preface one time to Tornberg's book on tarot cards. Now all of
yeah.
a sudden you've got Morello saying, "Well, we need to retrieve tarot cards and so on," and his
Yeah,
point
I'm
is.
really intrigued by this. Go ahead. I've never heard your critique of
Well,
this because I'm
his
intrigued.
point is an interesting one, and I think one that Kingsnorth would agree with, Tolkien would agree with, Lewis would agree with, Balthasar would agree with, which is this. I was critical earlier of paganism, animistic paganism,
hmm
because it was devoid of Christian orientation and had the apotheosis of all kinds of nasty stuff.
Yeah,
Uh, Nevertheless, what about paganism's understanding that the universe is charged with the grandeur
yeah,
of God. All
yeah,
right,
yeah,
like shook foil.
yeah.
That there are spiritual forces for good and for ill at work in our world. That the world is magical. Look at the popularity of Harry Potter
hmm
stories, of Lord
hmm
of the Rings stories. We do seek not just a re-enchantment of our moral universe. We seek a re-enchantment of the physical universe as well. So, is it perhaps possible, as Morello asks, to retrieve a kind of Christian concept, Catholic, incarnational, properly purged, transformed, elevated concept of magic? All
Right,
right. And
right.
I'm not certain I buy the whole thesis, but I think, there's certainly elements of that here and I'm praising this in
Yeah,
Kingsnorth's book,
right.
where,
Right. And I would say that again, look at the sort of the presuppositions of modernity, right? The presuppositions of modernity rest upon the utter disenchantment of the world as mere material. And, you think of, there's something really kind of wrong with that, insofar as the well, as you have already invoked Hopkins, the world is charged with the grandeur of God, right? That um, there's a certain power that Lewis talks about with the discarded image, that when you can simply close one of your eyes, right, to the sort of the metaphysical enchantments of the physical universe, you can do great things, right?
yes.
You can turn the world into what Heidegger calls the standing reserve. And there's an immense creative potential in closing one of your eyes, so to speak, right? One eye upon the physical world, one eye upon the sort of the metaphysical reality, right? If you shut off that metaphysical half,
Yeah. Yeah.
then you can do incredible things because you're no longer hindered with the necessary pieties toward the natural world. And there's a way in which you can read modernity as exactly that, is the unleashing of the powers of the physical universe when you no longer have a reference to metaphysical realities and therefore metaphysical obligation.
Oh, that's all so good. And that what you want, then you really can't control what you unleash in so many ways. You
But
become
you
a
believe you can. You
Yeah.
believe you can. It's the Sorcerer's Apprentice all over again, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, and I know Kingsnorth is big on the work of McGilchrist
Right,
in this work. He talks
right,
about the master and his emissary,
right,
left brain, right brain, and
right.
so what we have in modernity, with the rise of modernity, is the total hypertrophy
Hmm.
of the left
Hmm.
brain and the
Hmm.
hypotrophy of the right brain.
Right,
And if
right.
we could find a way to restore the supremacy of the right brain, then
Hmm.
there might be a way for us to restore our mystical awareness that the natural world is charged with spiritual reality. We have to remember St. Francis of Assisi, for example, you know, he's like the Dr. Doolittle of the Catholic world. I mean, he spoke to the
Yep,
freaking animals and
yep,
whatnot. Now, this is
yep.
not just mythology.
Right, right.
Okay, there's a sense in which, and Lewis talks about this as well, that, in a prelapsarian world, we might have even been able to control our own digestive processes and
Right,
so on and so
right.
forth. That our mastery of the material world, because it is essentially logos before it is matter, is directly related to our mystical right brain side. This is Morello's
And
point. And go
and
ahead.
and and you look at St. Paul's rather cryptic but fascinating speculations on the resurrected body. And
Yes.
and I think there's such an important terrain to be mined there. He's talking about Jesus's his post-resurrection body and his ability to pass through matter and he's not a ghost, in other words, right? And it's
Right.
such a it's
Right.
such an important component, that we have these seemingly simple, and I'm sure people would be derisive and, oh, Jesus is eating fish after the resurrection. Oh, and Thomas is poking his hands into Jesus's wounds and all of that. It's not insignificant, right? You look at the wisdom that is captured in those stories, and they are absolutely insistent upon the bodily resurrection. And so therefore, if you start to really think about the bodily resurrection, you recognize, as you just said, that logos precedes matter. That the master precedes the emissary, right? If you sort of
Yes.
using that,
Yes.
and so as we contemplate, our telos, right? We will have resurrected bodies as well, and so therefore, to me, the image of the New Jerusalem and the redemption, not just of souls, but the redemption of the world. I can't help but think that this means for us that civilization is good. And we have to do everything in our capacities and powers to radically assert the goodness of civilization. And there's a kind of desire to kind of wash your hands and be free of all these sort of things, live on top of the stylite, and all that kind of.
Yeah.
But no, I think we have to assert in a full-throated fashion that as off the rails as civilization has become, and Larry, I don't think anybody can get in front of the two of us in terms of our
That's right.
deep frustrations with the sickness of the world must be redeemed too. Not just gotten through, not just passed, but the world is our destiny in that redemptive sense. And I worry, that there's a kind of neo-Gnostic impulse
Yes.
to shed matter and become pure spirit. And to me, that's as deadly. And maybe that's what Morello's getting at. I don't want to, you know it better
Well,
than
no,
me.
I think he is getting at all of this, that we have to avoid the Gnosticism and dualism and so forth
Right,
of paganism,
right.
and that
And
magic.
remember, and remember, Lewis in Mere Christianity makes that point. He says, look, of all of the world's heresies and whatnot, the only one that ever tempted him, he says, was a robust dualism. Like
Yes,
Manichaeism. He says that
that's right.
there's something robust about that, but he said it must be resisted, right? Because Jesus is a man too, right? That
Yeah,
that all of those fights about the nature of Christ, the nature of Jesus, the homeostatic union, and all of that is an attempt to preserve something super centrally important. And Gnosticism is so tempting because it almost allows you to sort of just wipe your hands clean of that. And I don't think we have that as an option ultimately.
No, and Kingsnorth is very clear about this, and I don't
Yeah.
want to imply at all
Yeah.
that
Right.
that
Right.
Paul
Right.
Kingsnorth is flirting with this. He has several chapters on the transgender movement and the
Right.
erasure of embodiment.
Right.
That one of the goals of the modern machine, modern transhumanism, transgenderism, and so forth, is the obliteration of the
Right.
importance of our embodiment.
Right. And
Uh,
this is where, I'm reminded of Vogelin. Vogelin in The New Science of Politics basically says the entirety of modern ideologies can be distilled into neo-Gnosticism. Like that is what it is, in its Nazi variant, in its communist variant, that's the great temptation of the first, of the mid-century, right, is precisely a kind of
yes.
Gnostic special knowledge, right? And I think that's a
Well,
salient.
yeah, it goes back. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No,
Go
no,
ahead.
no, no.
It goes back to Descartes and
Yeah,
the Cartesian revolution, where everything since then has simply been to equate our spiritual side or our mental side, our conscious side, as a kind of ghost in the machine.
right,
That the
right.
world is a machine essentially, and I don't give a damn about quantum theory. Most people still live in the basic data level within the world of Newtonian realism.
Yep,
Quantum theory is true, I think, in various permutations, but we nobody can get their mind around the indeterminacy of quantum theory. We can sort of say, oh yeah, quantum,
right,
yeah,
right.
quantum. But in reality, we live in the macro universe. We live in a Newtonian world, and thus we make this distinction between spirit and matter in radical ways that then bleaches the material world, bleaches
Interesting,
it entirely
interesting.
of spirit.
Bleach
Uh,
is not in terms of cleaning, but rather in stripping away.
Oh yeah, it
Yeah, okay.
denudes it. It
Yeah,
destroys it. It
yeah,
eliminates the spiritual.
right.
And so but we desire to see the spiritual in material things. And the incarnationalism and Kingsnorth brings this out. He does, the
Yeah,
incarnationalism of Christianity is of great benefit here. And in purging traditional magical elements of their crypto Gnostic sort of underpinnings. Now, to give not the reason why Gnosticism is a perennial temptation.
yeah,
I mean, and you can go all the way back to Plato as well, is because the human mind, unaided by revelation, is quite naturally going to fall if you want to affirm the realm of spirit as real. You see that the material things die and pass away and turn back into the soil. So if there's going to be something that perdures post death, then it obviously can't be a material substance of some kind. It's
right,
got to be
right,
this other thing called spirit,
right,
hence the rise of
right,
Greek dualistic philosophical thinking.
right.
Now, we don't want, and we don't want to put too neat a bow on that because
But
it's
but
complex,
but
but
yeah, yeah,
so this eventually morphs into all the various forms of Gnosticism,
right,
right? So you have pro-cosmic dualism that says matter is essentially good, but it's not permanent,
right,
and ultimately unimportant. And then there's anti-cosmic dualism, which is what most Gnostics are. They're anti-material,
right.
contrary to the material world.
Right. I'm going to keep talking Lewis because it's on my brain, but in the that hideous strength is the third installment of a three-part series. The first is Out of the Silent Planet, and the second is Paralandra. And in Out of the Silent Planet, Ransom finds himself kidnapped and brought to Mars, Malacandra, they call it in the book, and you see all of this sketched out, right, in a kind of like in a fable, right? But it's real.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
and in that world, in two things strike me. That the world, all things die, right? And so Weston, the kind of antagonist of the first and the second novels, is that voice of modernity, and his project is one of colonialization, right? Which I think is very resonant with what Kingsnorth is drawing out. And Weston can't stand the idea that matter dies. Okay, so that's number one. And so he's going to do everything in his power. He's going to crack as many eggs as he can to to sort of extend, mankind.
Yeah.
And the Eldila, the angel figure, the guardian angel figure of Malacandra says, look, this planet is dying. Yours will too, right? And so that's a significant point, I think, to make. We understand as Christians that the world time ends, right? There's a telos, there's a encapsulation of time. But secondly, in that world of Malacandra, you've got sort of three orders of creatures. They're called Hanau, right? And you've got in the middle, you've got the Hrossa, and they are the poet hunters. And above them are the Sorns, and the Sorns are the kind of the philosophical Platonic
Right.
figures, the sort of the holders of we would call them philosophers, right? Something like that. But then below them are the Piffletriggi, and the Piffletriggi are these characters who are machinists, right? They not in the machine sense, but they work with machines, right? And this is so in this world, this fully integrated world, you've got the philosophers, the poets, and the builders, right? And they all kind of work in this symbiotic relationship that is a vital and important one. And I think what
Right.
Lewis is doing there is he's sort of sketching out sort of the trifold nature of civilization, we might say. And so what really strikes me though is that in Kingsnorth's book called Against the Machine, he only talks about the machine in terms of its kind of cancer-like growth of modernity. He doesn't. I was really hoping he would go back to the sort of the six classic machines, right? The lever, the wheel and axle, the pulley, the inclined plane, the wedge, and the screw. Like these miracles of human invention work completely in concert with the contours of the created order. And it is these simple six machines which afford a kind of an opening up and an extension of the human and the way that the human can interact with his environment to build a civilization, right? And
The
again,
pyramids.
well, we're right. And so, and again, I hate when people their book reviews essentially amount to, this is the book I would have written, and Kingsnorth wrote a different one. And so I'm very conscious of what I'm doing
Yeah.
here, but I wanted a little bit more about technology, not just as that which affords the machine, capital T, capital M, or the technium, or the technique, as Alul will talk about it, but rather, these small human-scaled machines which allow us to create a civilization.
Yeah, exactly. I had the same question, the same frustration. Uh,
Again, and
Obviously,
I feel like a jerk. I feel like a jerk because
well, in the sense though, in a book called Against the Machine, to have a deficit of definitional clarity or
mhm,
philosophical clarity
mhm.
as to what exactly you mean by the machine, uh, I think that is something that is open to criticism
Yeah.
because latent within the entire conversation is the question of our liminal existence in a sort of what he wants to be a pre-machine sort of state. And yet what even the Amish have kerosene lamps, right?
Correct.
You know,
Well,
even the Amish use metal utensils.
yeah. And I look, and I'm not an Amish. I don't pretend to be an Amish, but I like the fact that the Amish are intentional about what technologies they allow and what they don't. And there's a very interesting. I mean, you know this. You live in Pennsylvania. There's a process by which they
Sure.
discern as a community what technologies they will allow or not. They're not. Uh, They're not, it's
Yeah.
interesting. I can't believe I'm saying this out loud, but they're not radical about it or unthinking about it. There's an intentionality behind it. And I do think that Kingsnorth is attempting to work through that. But, there is that intentionality about technology. It's not a either or
Well, that's why I
standpoint.
brought up earlier, that even shamanistic animism was a kind of techne.
Right,
That
right.
that human beings, if you want to define the essence of technology is the human attempt to bend the natural
That's
world
right.
to our well-being.
And I
All
would
right.
prefer to instead than bend, which is fair, but
Well, fine,
but to shape, right?
to
To
shape it.
shape
Yes.
and to create, right? And
Yes.
so if we can if there's a way, if there's a capacity in us to figure out how technologies can shape a world of human
Yeah.
flourishing, then amen, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Amen.
yeah, the first human beings to move out of a cave
Right.
and to construct their own house out of wood or mud or
Yep.
whatever was
Yep.
engaged in some kind of techne.
Right.
And so the question, you have philosophers of technology like George Grant, Hugh Grant, but
That's
George
yeah.
George Grant, in the Canadian philosopher, and
Mhm.
Jacques Ellul. He mentions Jacques Ellul several times in this book, but the need, I think, for greater specificity with regard to different levels of techne. And I think, okay, to give Kingsnorth his due, I think he's assuming is this. All right. Once again, this is not a major, huge
Yeah.
academic tome. What he's assuming is that we are all feeling a sense of disquietude
Yes. Yeah.
about the digital computer age in which
Yeah.
we live.
Right.
Industrialization was bad enough, okay?
Yep.
But now we live in the sort of industrial age on steroids,
Hmm.
an entirely different set of qualia and how we
Good.
experience
Yes.
existence.
Yes.
So the
What do you
qualia
mean?
of
What do
our
you mean by qualia? This is important. I
our
love this.
our subjective experience of existence,
Yeah.
okay, not by any standard of, oh, we can make these objective criteria or whatever about which technologies are good and no, we have subjective experience of existence, the
Mhm.
qualia, red, green, uh, rose, bacon smell, all these sorts of subjective experiences that philosophers of consciousness still cannot explain, the qualia of our consciousness. Well, the quality of our experience of technology has now morphed into something that is exceedingly dangerous. And I agree
Right.
with Kingsnorth
Right.
here.
Right. And apropos of the AI apocalypse that we seem to be flirting with here, and you know, I'm trying very hard to be measured about what's going on with Silicon Valley and the rush toward, so-called AGI, artificial general intelligence. I personally don't think that AGI is possible, but I don't think that matters. I think that it'll be good enough
Yes.
and more and powerful enough. And if you listen closely to the way that both the proponents of the AI arms race and the detractors, is that they will both admit, somewhat begrudgingly with the proponents, with the cheerleaders, that we are not building AIs, we are growing them. And I find that a fascinating turn of phrase,
Yeah, you mentioned that
Larry.
in your interview with Grim, whatever
Yeah,
his name is. Yeah.
yeah. In other words, look, you've worked on a farm. You know
Yeah.
exactly what this means, that you don't make your sheep, you don't make your crops,
I grow them.
you cultivate them,
Yeah.
right? And they're doing the work. You are giving them the necessary conditions with which they can flourish or not. And if we are not building it, we are most certainly not in control of it. So the potential irony of ironies, as the machine builds itself out into artificial intelligence, whether it's general or not, it doesn't matter. We aren't in control of these things. And so, therefore, what is in control of these things? And that's where I find, again, Lewis to be somewhat helpful here, that in his fictional setting of that hideous strength, it turns out that the macrobes are in charge of the machine. In other words, demons, full stop.
Yes, yes,
And
yes, yes.
so I wonder how much of Kingsnorth's book is really trying to render an account of what does it mean to build a civilization in which the demons are in charge. Do you know
Absolutely.
what I mean by that?
I know exactly what you mean, and I read it the same way. That's
Yeah,
what the strength of this book is, that it
right.
is a prophetic call to
Yeah,
arms. It is a
yeah,
profound
yeah.
meditation on the destruction of humanity as such, our erasure by the modern digital world. And that's why he
Mm.
goes on and on about transgenderism and
Right,
transhumanism. These are
right,
not simply sidebar conversations in
right.
the ongoing march of
That's right.
something or other.
Right. And
This
it's
is
not just like you and I being mean,
no,
and that's what's so
no.
frustrating about these conversations. It's like, no, this is actually right in the main line of what's going on.
We seek to be liberated. He even
Right.
mentions, Sister
Right.
Elia Delio, who we interviewed at DeSales for a job years ago. Good Lord, thank
Wow.
God we didn't
Wow.
hire her. Where
Wow.
she says, yeah, let's have robot priests that are,
Wow.
genderless and blah
Right.
blah. And I'm reading that going, yeah, she's a Franciscan nun, and so she's got into all this weirdo stuff. But anyway, I don't want to
Not
go
all
down.
shock.
Yeah, exactly. So the point is the liberation from our embodiment, liberation from our bodies, which is going to be the erasure of just about everything. And then the goal obviously is some kind of bizarro immortality where we upload our consciousness
Yeah,
into
that's just
which is
straight
stupid.
transhumanism. Straight
And
transhumanism.
yeah, it's also stupid
Yeah.
because it just presumes that subjectivity is nothing more than the exudations of our brains.
Right.
And if somehow or another we can take those exudations, the informational bits that are there, and upload them into a computer, that it'll be the same person. It won't
I
be.
mean, what's so wild,
It'll be
Larry?
a simulacrum of me, but it won't be
You're
me.
right. Right. What's so fascinating to me as I hear these people talk in these terms is that literally in 1943, when C.S. Lewis is writing that Hideous Strength, he predicts each and
Yeah,
every one of these modern ideologies, these modern theologies, and they are theologies. It's so important, and
it
this is where
is.
we sort of steer into your wheelhouse a little here, but it's like every one of the main characters of the NICE, the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments, all come at it from a slightly different angle because they all have a peculiar kind of devil that whispers in their ears. And this kind of transhumanist spirit stuff, has such a religious valence that goes, I think, underappreciated. And I think Kingsnorth is like right there on that. He's
Yeah.
absolutely nailing these things. And again, guys, read that Hideous Strength. I mean,
Oh yeah.
it really contains, Lewis speed ran the entirety of what we are currently living through before the Second World War was over. I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly.
that's insight.
Exactly.
That's
And
prophecy.
Kingsnorth mentions Huxley as well, Brave New
Yes,
World, where Huxley correctly prophesied that the totalitarianism of the future would be a totalitarianism rooted in pleasure,
that's right.
not the bloody totalitarianism of Stalin or Mao or
Right,
Hitler,
right,
but the pleasure principle as a
right,
totalitarian impulse.
right, right.
And that is so prophetic. It's so true.
Yeah,
It's Walker Percy's orgasmatron.
that's right. No, I know. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So Larry, I think we would be remiss. I mean, here we are, we're into this, but I think we would be remiss not to mention what Kingsnorth calls the four P's of traditional
Yeah,
human culture and the four S's of modernity. And so the four P's of traditional culture are people, place,
place,
prayer, and
prayer,
the
and the
past,
past.
right? And those have been replaced by the four S's of modernity, or
Sex, science, self, and
the
screen.
screen. Exactly.
The
That's exactly
screen.
right.
Yeah.
And I think that's, again, it's a very helpful little heuristic. Like we can, I've heard people critique those things, and kind of,
Well, go repeat them. Repeat
yeah,
them,
yeah.
Kale.
So we've got people, place, prayer, and the past, right? Those are sort of the bedrocks of traditional human cultures, and
Right.
then which have been replaced by science, the self, sex, and the screen, right? As foundational elements, and you can see that those are the sort of the theological axioms of the theology of modernity, right? I'm using that very deliberately. I think that we have to think of modernity not as like the as a we finally gotten to the like the most important things, but no, this is an assertion of axiomatic principles, in which you can build out a logic of a world, and we live in the built out logic of that world, the science, the
Yeah.
self, sex, and the screen.
What's interesting, though, is this. As we become slaves of those things, of the
Yep,
apotheosis of my imperial self,
yep,
of sexual pleasure through pornography and everything else, the rise of science, follow
right,
the science.
right.
Nothing irritated me more during COVID than
No, of
follow
course.
the science. Whose science, you
Right.
morons? All right, as if I'm going to go down this rabbit hole a bit. The
Go.
myth there is, and Kingsnorth talks about this, that there is this whole mythology of modern science,
Mhm.
this elevation of science to this, to where to the scientist now becomes a kind of priest, prophet, and king,
Yeah,
almost a sinless figure. Follow the science. Follow the science. That mantra could have come out of that hideous strength
absolutely.
of Lewis's. Follow the
Yep,
science. And yet now it turns out, oh, the science of Pfizer and Moderna and
right,
Merck, the science of bought and paid for scientists,
right,
the
right,
science of trillion-dollar pills that don't
right,
work, the
right.
science of surveillance capitalism imposing itself upon you in
That's right,
allegiance with the state. In that
right.
sense, Kingsnorth book reminds me of related books. And I think he wrote his book with an eye towards how it complements other works that have already been written, that it's
Yeah.
not this sui generis thing out
Yeah,
of nowhere.
it's an aggregation. Good, 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 good.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay. And so that's why I think rather than engage in all these fine-tuned discussions, philosophically speaking, of this, that, and the other thing,
yeah.
he simply presumes we have this experience of the
Hmm.
modern world as
Good.
this ever shrinking enclosure of
Yeah,
digital mastery over everything.
right.
I'm going to take that
Yeah.
as his baseline prophetic insight. And it reminds me of a book, and I'll turn it over to you,
Yeah.
by the philosopher Anton Barbacay called
Oh,
uh,
yes.
A Web of Our Own Making,
Yeah.
which he's
Whew.
very pessimistic.
Oh,
Where
and it's good though. Whew.
oh, it's so good, and you
Yeah.
walk away scared as hell. Now, that's a
Oh,
10-year-old book now, and it's like,
yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
10 years ago he was saying the internet is a web of our own making. It's slowly entrapping us, and then of course. Now a book that's 15 years old, Sojana Zuboff's book, The
Yeah.
Rise of Surveillance
Right.
Capitalism, is back over here, where
Yep.
she mentions the rise of big tech, this web of the internet, surveillance capitalism, watching every move with the surveillance state
Right.
combined with that. Okay. And then throw in Eugene McCarraher's Enchantments of Mammon. I see Kingsnorth book exactly in that stream of thought.
No, that's so good. I think that's exactly right. And remember the machine that preceded the machine was bureaucracy. Right. And I'm currently teaching an online course right now. I'm going to shill mercilessly here. I'm teaching an online course on Dickens' A Christmas Carol.
Oh,
And
good. Go. Yeah. Plug yourself.
so I'm doing it deliberately, not because nobody knows the story. Everybody knows the story, right? But I find it is a peculiar blessing to reread something of which you are basically familiar and to sort of really mine some deep embedded wisdoms. And you look at a character like Scrooge, and Scrooge has, in essence, he's a money counter. He is a master of the exchange, and he has simply turned the world into anything is real if it can show up on a ledger. Anything is real if you can count it and sell it and exchange it and barter it. And anything that falls outside of the ledger simply does not exist. And so as the story goes, the spirit of Christmas, of course, is a cry against the ledger book. It's a cry against
Yes.
modern bureaucracies. And by the way, you can sign up. It's in my bio. We still have 3 more classes left to go. And you have access to the recordings, but they are live sessions. But my point here is that it's not just like digital machines that
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
talking about here. We're talking about a whole kind of system, or you can think of like the internet, like you said, not necessarily as this sort of network of interconnectedness, but what if we flip the script and look at the internet as this sort of form of digital enclosure? And remember, the digital enclosure was preceded by the digitization of the ledger book, by the digitization of the bureaucracies of the 19th century.
Oh yeah.
And therefore, how do you affect a kind of standpoint, a position, live a life that recognizes in some inescapable way that we have to live in that space, but we don't have to be of it. And
Yeah.
therefore our theology, I think, is so rich in that regard.
Oh, and yeah, to be of the world, in the world, but not of
Right.
it. And Kingsnorth talks about this, and we're going to get into that now. But before we do, I
Yeah.
just want to say, in my opinion, the best film characterization of Ebenezer Scrooge was done by George C. Scott. I,
Oh,
I
I have to say this to you. I've always thought of you and George C. Scott in the same register, Larry. Like, you've got his voice, he's so good. Anyway, that's a compliment.
oh,
It
well,
should be
good,
pointed out.
because
Yeah.
I absolutely loved uh,
Yeah. So good.
his rendition of
Yeah.
Scrooge because he humanizes Scrooge.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's
So important. So
it's not
important.
cartoonish. It's
Yeah.
not cartoonish.
Yeah.
He puts flesh and blood on
Yeah.
Ebenezer Scrooge and
Yeah.
makes you think this could be a real
I could,
person.
I could be, and
I
it
could
could be
be
me.
Scrooge. It could be
Right. Right.
me.
Absolutely.
It could
Absolutely.
be me. No, George C. Scott was brilliant in that regard. Okay, so you mentioned to be in the world but not of it, and this is sort of in the last section of Kingsnorth's book, which is really excellent in so many ways. He's trying to answer the question. Okay, Poindexter. So what do we do now? Okay, I mean, and you and I get this all the time.
Yeah.
Anybody that's a
Yeah.
major critic of modernity in all of its various permutations, you're always going to get this question. Okay, smarty pants,
Yep.
what's
Yep.
your answer to the problem? And
Right.
the fact is, there's no magic bullet. There's no single answer to the problem, and you're stuck in a world that you didn't make. All right, and you're thrown into it. So I like the fact he talks about the need for radical reactionaries. I
Good.
see so much resonance in these last chapters between his version of anarchism and resistance to the Leviathan of the modern state,
Hmm.
and all becoming sort of radical reaction. So much resonance with Dorothy Day and the Catholic
Yes.
worker movement,
Yes.
and not just Dorothy Day, but people like Monnier and stuff
Yeah.
like that. Emmanuel Monnier, the early personalists in the
Yeah.
Catholic, especially the French tradition,
Yeah.
this need to sort of rage against the machine and the need to create cultures within a culture. He talks about the creation of what I like this. He calls them shatter zones, where
Yeah.
you fight centralization and
Yeah.
efficiency and straight lines, and as you said, bureaucracy. You fight that by simply scattering. All right, and creating shattered sort of subcultures that das Ganze fragment. All right, that even in the fragment there's the whole.
Yeah.
There's the
Yeah.
whole. So it
Yes.
scatters, and yet the whole is still in each of the little parts,
Yeah.
which forms little hubs of resistance.
Yeah. You're talking
That's
about the fractal nature of creation itself.
yeah,
That God
yeah.
is even in the fragments. Keep going. Sorry.
Yeah, and so I mean, this is that's actually from a title of one of Balthasar's books, Das Ganz im Fragment,
Mm.
in which he talks about the hyper particularism of Christianity. I
Yes.
mean, that the incarnation of God is an absolute revelation of God in a single historical man is not a contradiction with any sort of universalization of
Wow.
certain principles.
That's so
That in
good.
fact Christianity sees in the entirety of everything in this single particular human being.
Love it.
That is the incarnational principle that then
Right.
suffuses Catholic sacramental spirituality. And I see that at work in Kingsnorth's book here,
Yeah.
where he says that even in these little small enclaves, we can resist what he calls the enclosure of
Ah,
modernity. In that regard, and
so
then I'll
good.
turn it over to you. He
Yeah.
talks about the difference, and I love this, absolutely love this. He talks about the difference between raw and cooked barbarians.
Yeah. Yeah. It's good.
In other
Yeah.
words, he wants us to be barbarians in the sense of resisting the
Yeah.
so-called civilization of the modern digital
It's
world.
John. It's John the Savage from Brave New World. Keep
That's
going. Yeah.
right. So
Yeah.
yeah, okay.
Which,
So
of course, before John the Savage, we have St. Francis, right? And
exactly.
I think St. Francis is the great prophet of exactly what you're talking about. He's the great prophet of the incarnation, as Chesterton lays it out
And
in
this is
his
why,
wonderful
yeah.
book.
And Kingsnorth, I love it. And I've said this too before. What we need is the re-weirding of Christianity.
Yes. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the re-weirding in this barbaric sense of we are so Christian and so
Mhm.
deeply imbued with a true sense of reality that we become absolutely anomalous, weird little entities that the modern world cannot digest. On our
Almost.
farm, there's a noxious weed here in northeast Pennsylvania. You might have it up there too. It's a multiflora rose. They're wild rose bushes that grow, and they're noxious and they proliferate. And it's because they have little berries on them, and the birds eat the berries, and the birds digest the berry part, but they can't digest the seeds.
They
And
spread
so
it. Yeah.
then they spread these things. And
Yeah.
so Kingsnorth doesn't mention this, but we have to become like the multiflora rose. In other
Yeah.
words, we can
Yeah.
be digested by the modern
That's
world,
oh,
but
that's so good.
there's got to be a core of us that gets into the bird
Yeah.
of modernity and
Yeah.
shat out the
I
other
love
end
it. No, that's so
someplace.
great. No, I absolutely love that. I think that's really great. That's really great. I've been thinking about the Shadow Zone thing and all of this. You know, I can't help but hear certain resonances with Dreer's notion of the Benedict option.
Oh, good. Now I wanted to go there, so go ahead.
And just like what Saint Benedict himself did, right? He opted out in some way and created the shadow zone, which we know of as the monastery, right? And the monastery becomes the thing that seeds Christendom, full
Yeah,
stop. And
yeah.
so I wonder what kind of resonances did you see between Kingsnorth's work and Dreer's work in the Benedict option?
I see a lot of resonances. Rod is an urban guy, and
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Rod doesn't seem to share Kingsnorth's super romanticization of the natural world.
No, he's
Uh,
from Louisiana. How could he?
yeah,
Keep
well,
going. Keep it.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, where it's 9 million degrees in the
yeah.
shade in
Right,
January.
right,
But then,
right.
you know, yeah. So by the way, as a Nebraskan, I blame you Louisianans for our summer weather too. Because Nebraska gets either super cold weather from Canada or we get Gulf of Mexico weather
Right.
because
I
there are
know.
no natural.
You're in a tough. You're in that cross zone. It's
Oh,
tough. It's tough.
good
Yeah.
God. Good. That's why it's Tornado Alley too, where the
Yeah.
cold and the
Yeah.
warm collide. But anyway, neither here nor Rod, however, has that monastic
Yeah.
sense of the
Yeah.
need to be of the in the world but not of it. One of the
Hmm.
great false accusations against Rod Dreher, and it's like fingernails on a chalkboard
Yeah.
to me when I hear it, is that he's like an escape to the hills guy.
Right. Oh, it's so
Let's
bad.
flee everything guy. Let's to hell with the modern world and run away kind of guy. He's not that, nor is Kingsnorth.
Right.
Uh, they're about the creation of cultures within a culture, as
Right.
Kingsnorth specifically says. Rod Dreher is about the cultivation of strong subcultures of Christian identity
Right.
in order to be that little seed in the berry that the
That's
bird
right.
can't digest.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. And one of the, and this is in keeping with what you're talking about here. One of the authors that Kingsnorth brings up is an historian by the name of Lewis Mumford,
Oh
and
yeah,
um, and
oh
I like
yeah,
Mumford a lot. I mean, I've got my critiques of Mumford, but Mumford has this book called Techniques in Civilization, and he again, contra to the Enlightenment myth, he systematically lays out the birth of civilizational technology as being rooted in the monastery, right? And so even
oh
like our
yeah.
notions of the clock, like, the clock was built in the monastery as a mechanism, a machine, if you will, but an extension of the human as a machine in that sense, so that the monks could pray on time, right? And so even within Christianity, we have this tension between spirit and order, right? And so in the heart of the monastery is birthed all of these labor saving devices so that you could work and pray. right? And therefore Rod's invocation, whether he intended this or not, of the Benedictine monastery, I think is so vital to the renewal of
Yeah.
civilization, right? That it is when we have fled the monastery as a culture, the monastery as the beating heart and the lifeblood of civilization in Christendom as we appreciate it. It's in fleeing that monastery and the ethos of the monastery and the ultimate point of the monastery, which is, of course, to pray without ceasing, right? That's what it is. But we've abandoned that. And so when I hear Rod invoke the Benedict option, and when I hear Kingsnorth do his own kind of radical version of the Benedict
Yeah.
option,
Yeah.
I'm seeing some deep resonance between
Oh,
those two.
huge resonances. I mentioned before his distinction between raw and cooked barbarians, and
Yeah,
what Kingsnorth means by that is a raw barbarian is somebody who has essentially escaped the clutches of the
right.
machine and lives in a sort of off the grid,
Yeah.
pristine sort of, and
Again,
that's
stylite,
yeah,
stylite.
exactly. A stylite or whatever. Exactly. And that's going to be rare. That's
Yeah,
going to be rare.
yeah,
The sort of Carthusian who lives in a cave
right,
someplace. That's raw barbarian.
right,
The rest of us have to be cooked barbarians, meaning, we're still barbarians, but we have to live in the world. We
right,
have spouses, we have
right,
children, we have
right.
jobs. And so Kingsnorth himself mentions in the book, look, I'm sitting here writing my book on a
On a
laptop
laptop.
computer
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and as much as I hate the screen and so forth.
right,
So he says that the trick is we have to go down a rabbit hole and hope of technology in order to use it against the technology.
right.
And hopefully, as we go down the rabbit hole, we don't confront the killer rabbit of Monty Python and the Holy
Yeah,
Grail.
yeah, yeah. Right,
And
right, right. That's good. That's
we
good.
don't encounter the killer. He doesn't mention Monty Python, but I thought when he says
I
when
love
we
it.
go down a rabbit hole and find a rabbit, we're in trouble. Well, yeah,
It's got
special.
huge fangs
Yeah,
in
yeah. Look at his face. Look at the bones. Look at the bones.
it. So good,
Yeah,
so good.
yeah, so good. I'm showing my age though,
Yeah, I know. We all
but
these old references that we're invoking here. It's all right, man. It's all right.
but yeah. So Kingsnorth says we have to be willing. So here's where the theologian in me comes out, and also the metaphor of the berry on the rose bush that's only partially digested,
Mm,
killed in a sense to be resurrected as something else.
beautiful.
There is a going down. There is a kenotic element here. There
Yeah,
is you see this the asceticism involved of immersing yourself in this world in order to undermine this world from within
yeah,
by by being a virtuous spiritual person
yeah.
who resists and resists
That's
and
right.
resists. There's going to be an element of death there. There's an element
Yeah,
of danger there. You cannot, because he himself says, and there's an element of Marshall McLuhan here, right?
absolutely.
Avoid the damn temptation of thinking that computers are simply a neutral tool. This is
Correct.
such a
Amen.
stupid
Amen.
concept. All right.
Amen. Amen.
The medium is the message, and in the very use of a smartphone, in the very use of a
Yeah,
computer,
yeah.
something is changing within you.
Right. Right.
Okay, and
And,
therein is the danger that we face as
yeah.
spiritual people.
And I would like to just insert here, one of the great, one of the most potent tenets of the myth of modernity is the neutrality of
Oh yeah.
the machine. And, I cannot tell you how many times people will tell me, oh, well, the technology is just neutral. It's neither here nor there. And like that is a lie we tell ourselves in order to sleep at night, and to me, the great prophetic quality of this book and why I absolutely recommend it is that he knows and he tells us and he reminds us that, and we all know this, Larry, there's a kind of a lack of meaning and a lack of rootedness that is part and parcel of the lives we lead in Modernia. And we need to be honest about that.
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned the clock before.
Yeah.
I mean, before the invention of the timepiece, how did people tell time? They looked to the
The
sky.
sun.
The position of the sun was the normal way that you would have a sundial. You might have an hourglass with sand in it. But I mean, even in the New Testament, we hear that there's the third hour, the ninth
That's right.
hour.
That's right.
There's
That's
always
right.
been a coming together of mathematics and the
Right.
passage of time as
Right.
human beings discuss these things. It's not That's not a modern invention. What
Correct.
is a modern invention is that we don't gauge the third or the ninth hour based on where the sun is. We don't judge what month it is based on the cycles of the moon.
Yeah.
We look at a stupid thing I mean, well, even this is an anachronism. I think we
Yeah.
have the same. No, 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 we don't. I have a Timex here. I like this one because you push a button and it lights up at
Yeah.
night, and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah. That's
blind.
funny.
I'm
That's
blind
funny.
at night, so it helps me tell what time. But that's how
Yeah.
slavishly indebted to my
Yeah.
timepiece I am. All right, in the middle of the night, I'll wake up and I'll go, "What the hell time? What time is it?"
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
now, so we go from, "Oh, isn't this liberating?" Now we have the exact measurement of time to now we're slaves of the damn
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
And so it's not neutral. It's not a neutral. It
Right.
absolutely transformed human culture, which is why in so many like European cities, and they're beautiful, you find right in the main town
Love it.
square of these ancient medieval cities, giant clocks, right? Giant clocks in the middle of the most magnificent cathedral or town
Yep.
hall or
Yeah.
whatever. Big Ben.
Well, and of course, the bells, ringing the
Yes.
quarter, the quarters and the hour, it's ubiquitous. It's beautiful. I mean, I love it. It's a little bit properly vague than the digital watch, right? But you're all called to an order of the day. It's beautiful, actually.
Yeah. And yeah, but there's also this interesting here. My grandparents had a real grandfather clock
Yeah,
with the pendulums and
yeah,
stuff,
yeah. The pull the
and,
thing.
and the bells were real bells and so
Yeah,
forth. But then my parents years later bought a grandfather clock that was it had fake pendulums
yeah.
and
Of
it was
course.
electronic and then
Yeah, of course.
a fake sense of bells.
Yeah,
And I remember thinking even as a kid, well, that's bogus.
that's bogus. Exactly. Like, well,
It's but there's a metaphor in there of
yeah.
something that Kingsnorth is talking about,
For sure.
right?
I love that. No, no, I think that's great. I think that's exactly right.
Where you go
And
from
it's a
real
spirit of
bells to
convenience and,
oh,
all that.
and while I'm at it,
Yeah.
churches that no longer have votive candles but have electric
Oh,
lights that
oh,
flicker.
oh, just the
Oh,
worst. Oh,
oh
the
my God.
worst.
Even in Rome, you go into major basilicas,
Just
all right,
brutal,
and they have the
man.
little flickering lights.
Absolutely brutal. Just absolutely brutal. I hate it.
Oh
Anyway.
God. Anyway, I guess we're sort of done here.
Yeah.
We've been at this, oh my goodness, almost an hour and a half, so
Yeah.
that's great. Time flies when I'm talking to Mr. Zeldin.
It's the
Is there
best, man.
anything else you want to add before we sign off?
No, man, just look, I hope everybody dives into the Advent season here. It's
Yeah,
important. Live a liturgical life. It's even when you don't want to, it's really important.
absolutely. And so once again, hi everyone, I want you to read Paul Kingsnorth Against the Machine on the unmaking of humanity. I wanted to get the mild criticisms out of the way at the beginning because I didn't want to end on a down note.
Yeah, right, right.
This is
Yeah,
a bit book very, very, very much worth reading,
yeah.
and it's an excellent read. Hey, Kale,
Amen.
thanks for being on today, buddy, and have a good Advent.
Love it. You too, brother. God bless.
Oh, by the okay, yeah, don't sign off. I want to talk to you real
Yeah.
quick
Yeah.
afterwards. All right, bye.